Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of Not Again with Sandy. There's 2 sweaters I want to talk to you about today that I completed early in my new knitting career, we could maybe say. But before we do that, I'd like to check in with my Leary tee. I've added quite a bit of length. I'm now beginning to do my increase rows, but I want to talk to you about something that I had to decide as I was starting that. The pattern says that after you've cast on the stitches for the underarm, you knit 24 rounds and then you do your first increase row. But it also says that that section should measure 3.25 inches. Mine didn't. It measured 2.5 inches. So now I had a decision to make. If I were to do the increases sooner, at shorter intervals, I'm going to have a more extreme angle of increase than if I have longer intervals between increases. And that is going to impact how the garment looks on me. Now, I personally like a longer garment, just like the tunic that I had in the last episode. I like garments that extend below my hips because I'm a pear-shaped woman and my hips are the largest part of me. And by having all of my garments end, over that widest part, beyond that widest part, I feel like that's a more flattering silhouette for me. So I think having a longer, slower increase is the right way to go. I measured my rows as they kept going on, and I finally realized that 30 rounds equals 3.25 inches for me. So that's what I'm going to do. Okay, let's talk about my first sweater from the past. Now, this was the second sweater that I dyed the yarn for, and also the last sweater I dyed yarn for, if that tells you anything. I chose just a medium purple, I think the same purple I used in my tunic actually, and I had more Knit Picks Wool of the Andes yarn, and I was all set to kettle dye it. No speckling this time, just a straight purple kettle dye. And my neighbor popped over and I thought, oh sure, she can come in. She might enjoy watching this. But I think it was just enough distraction for me, not blaming her, blaming my own ability to stay on task here. Because when I took the yarn out, it looked fine until I dried it. And then I could see there were parts of the skein that had not received as much dye as other parts. I think what had happened is I sort of folded it over and I just had not agitated it enough so the inside of that fold had access to the dye. It's really interesting how dye works that way. I mean, clearly, even though it was soaking in the dye bath, parts of the yarn had access to dye that other parts did not, or at least not as much. And it makes me think about the reels I like to watch from professional yarn dyers who will have these several skeins in a catering pan, and they're putting one color dye on one end, one color dye on the other end, and a different color in the middle. And it always amazes me that number one, those colors don't really mix much. And then when they flip them over, while there's been a little bit of dye maybe around the edges, the bottoms, the other sides of those skeins are essentially still bare, and they have another opportunity to dye and quite often use different colors too. But clearly, even though the water is sinking through to the bottom of the pan, the dye itself only gets so far, and you really have to make an effort to make sure that all of the yarn has access to all of the dye. And I had not done a good job of that during my first dyeing. So, as you guessed, I had a second dyeing where I laid it out in the catering pan with the lightest side available, and I basically just sort of spot dyed it. And it turned out fine. I'll put up a picture showing the knitted product, and you can see that it's fairly evenly dyed, And it just looks like it's more of a tonal color, which I could live with. So that worked out eventually. I will say though that I think multiple dyeing sessions and possibly the way I did them, probably definitely the way I did them, created a little bit of havoc with the yarn. As I was knitting it, I found there were a couple places where the yarn seemed to have degraded a little bit. It seemed weaker in some, and just small areas, and not frequently, but I'd never seen that before. So I think the way I did it is not to be recommended. Do it right the first time, and maybe just have some tea with your neighbor and start the dyeing after she goes home. Okay, so let's talk about what happened next. The sweater I was making is the May sweater, M-A-E. I'm putting my hands up here because it's got a deep V-neck on both front and back, by Andrea Mowry. I'll put a picture up here, you can see it. And of course, this looks adorable on her. It looks like kind of almost a little dressy sweater. I think depending on the yarn you would use, it could be, you know, really kind of fun to dress up. So I chose that sweater, I knitted it, and knitting was not a problem. It's a good pattern. But when I tried it on, I was not very enthusiastic about it. It seemed to be that that deep V neckline on both front and back allowed these side parts to kind of fall off my shoulders. It was frustrating, and it was sometimes troubling also how to style something underneath it. The yarn I chose had a little bit of scratchiness to it, and I didn't want it against my skin, but having another V-neck meant I had to kind of manage that. And I don't know, a crew neck didn't look good, so I ended up not really wearing the sweater. It was disappointing, and a lesson to me in, you know, paying attention to the style and the fashion and how I think it's going to look on me. I do that to this day. I will look at a picture of someone wearing a sweater they've made and I think, oh, that's so cute on them. And I'm missing the central point, which is it's cute on them. And if I try and imagine myself in the sweater, I get maybe a different view. So I'm trying to be more aware of what's going to look good on me. So that's, I think, a lesson we all need when we're looking at patterns. I'm going to put up some pictures of how it looked on me then, so you can get a feel for it. Just didn't seem to be an attractive sweater for me. All right, let's talk about the Boxy sweater. Boxy is a pattern by Joji Locatelli, and the construction of it is kind of like a big box. If you laid it down, it would be a big rectangle with these two little sleeves poking out here and kind of a boat neck collar opening. When I heard about it first, they said it was so flattering. Any body style could wear this and would look nice on them. And that's because it's so wide and it's sort of a drop shoulder and short sleeves, when you put your arms down, you have this nice draping along the bottom. And I thought, well, that sounds good. You know, it's something covering up my hips. You know, that's my main goal in everything I knit. So I got the pattern. I had some beautiful yarn, and it was a great travel project. You know, once you get all cast on, you're just knitting in the round, stockinette. I was, you know, using helical knitting with my 2 skeins to make sure I didn't have any pooling, and I sure didn't. As I was getting closer to the end, I tried it on, and it seemed to be ending right at the fullest part of my hips, which, you know, I don't like. So I added, I think, at least another skein to it. I think it was another 3 or 4 inches I added on the bottom because it was so wide that I think 1 skein is about what that ended up being. I blocked it, you know, laid it out, and let it dry. And when I tried it on, oh my goodness, it had the hem was so much further down than I expected. So now we need to talk about superwash yarn. Superwash yarn is wool that has been treated. Normal wool, untreated wool, has scales in it that allows the fibers to really kind of mesh together and lock in. And this is why if you have a wool sweater that you'd like to rip out and reuse the yarn, you're going to have a little bit of a challenge if it's the normal untreated wool getting those fibers apart. You may not be able to in some cases, depending on the yarn and the gauge of the pattern. So they have come up with a way to smooth those scales. And I think there's at least a couple ways. And one where it just strips the scales off, and another one where it just causes the scales to kind of lay down along the fiber stalk and not engage with other fibers. But superwash wool can drop after it's blocked. It gets relaxed enough that it will tend to be a longer garment than it was before you blocked it. And I did know that, and I was counting on it dropping a little bit, but it dropped so much more than I expected. So that was a good lesson to me. I probably should have stopped right where it was supposed to stop, which was at the fullest part of my hip, because any increase in length beyond that, it would have been perfect. But this was now really long. It looked like a dress. I'll put up a picture. It was like a short dress, and nothing I wore it with seemed to be attractive. It was too long with jeans. A friend of mine suggested maybe a capri length of yoga pants or leggings. And, you know, I don't know. I just never found something that really looked attractive to me, and that was frustrating. So here were these two sweaters that I had spent time and energy on, and in the end felt like the decisions I made along the way perhaps kept them from being successful for me. I just didn't feel comfortable wearing them in public. Until today, when I was preparing for this video, I pulled them out and I tried them on and got a very different experience. They both were much more attractive now than they had been then. Now, I'm a bit heavier than I was, than maybe more than a bit. And I think some of that extra inches that they're covering is assisting with that. I didn't really notice the May sweater's shoulders falling down on me anymore. And the length of the Boxy sweater was not near as bad. It was actually seemed appropriate and fashionable. I'll put up a picture of each of those so you can see that all of a sudden, I think they look better. I think I'm going to start wearing these sweaters now and getting some real good out of them. I'm so thankful that I didn't get rid of them or tear them out. I think that now they have their own little redemption story, and that's really fun. Thanks for joining me.